All right, I'm down to the last of my mass market paperbacks from those shelves right there, so I'm going to go over them in this video. On the back of that top shelf, we'll start with The Risen Empire by Scott Westerfeld, right there. And that is part of a duology that contains The Killing Worlds. So that's the second book of the duology right there. Then we get to a book that a lot of people who are into the King Arthur legend are probably very familiar with. This one is T.H. White's The Once and Future King, right there. And then one that I wasn't even aware existed because I've never really looked that much into it, but I came across this in a bookstore one day. This is The Book of Merlin, which I guess is either a sequel or a tie-in, or maybe it runs concurrently with The Once and Future King. I don't really know. But there's that. Here's another one that is kind of based on British history, I think, and it's supposedly what some of the actual King Arthur myths were taken from, I think. And this is the first book in the series, but I don't have the rest. I got this from a friend of mine that I used to work with. This is Jack White's The Sky Stone, right there. And then we completely jump away from King Arthur and we get Liz Williams' Empire of Bones. Not even sure what this one's about. Next, we have Tad Williams' cat adventure called Tail Chaser's Song, right there. I have that in ebook. I have all these Tad Williams in ebook. I don't know why I keep the physical copies, but well, for that one, I think I keep it for the map. For these ones, I think I keep them because I like the covers on most of them. Here's the first book in Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, The Dragon Bone Chair, right there. And then Stone of Farewell, book 2. And then these giant books to Green Angel Tower, part 1 and part 2, right there. Then we get to some military sci-fi, I think. This is called When Diplomacy Fails by Michael Z. Williamson. Right there. I've read one of his other books. It was pretty violent, but you know, not terrible. Pretty decent. Worth reading some of his other stuff. Then we get Bellwether from Connie Willis. I've read a few of her books. Most of them are okay if you can get past the kind of stupidity of some of the main characters. Lincoln's Dreams, right here. Another Connie Willis. This next one is the first book in David Wingrove's Chung Kuo series, which I think is a sci-fi series which uses a dominant China in a future world, basically. This one is called The Middle Kingdom. And then book 2 is The Broken Wheel. The White Mountain is book 3. Stone Within is book 4. On this one, you can see like the unfiltered version of the cover there. It's pretty good artwork. I think it's Jim Burns. Not 100% sure though. And then Beneath the Tree of Heaven, right there. And White Moon, Red Dragon. And the last one that I have in the series is called Days of Bitter Strength. I think there's at least one more book, which was called Marriage of the Living Dark, but I could never find it in the States. This was actually the first book of the series that I bought because I didn't realize that it was part of a big series. So once I found that out, I went and bought all the others. So anyway, that's the back side of that first shelf up there. Now the front of that shelf contains the last 4 books that are just general science fiction and fantasy, and those are Chelsea Quinn Yarborough's Blood Games. This is about the Comte Saint Germain. He's basically a vampire that lives through all these historical events and stuff. I read one other book by her called Out of the House of Life, which it was based in ancient Egypt, or based around an ancient Egypt archaeological dig, and that was the main reason I bought it, because I'm kind of fascinated with ancient Egypt. But the book itself, I didn't really enjoy it all that much. It was an okay book, but I thought it was going to be about the vampire, and there was only really part of it that was about the vampire. More of it was about one of his love interests and what she was doing. And then we get Carlos Ruiz Zafón, Marina. I think this is kind of one of his YA fiction books. I have The Shadow of the Wind and The Angel's Game and a couple of his other books. I haven't read those yet, but one of these days I'll get to them. And then some Timothy Zahn, non-Star Wars Timothy Zahn, Angel Mass, right here, and Manta's Gift. And that's the last of the general sci-fi for a while. Now we're getting into some Dungeons and Dragons related stuff, and these are some Dragonlance books. This is book 1 of the Minotaur Wars, Night of Blood. Book 2, Tides of Blood. Starting to see a theme. Book 3, Empire of Blood. So there you go. And then another book from the Lost Histories. This is volume 4, Land of the Minotaurs. So you can see all these first few books are Minotaur related. And then finally, Kaz the Minotaur. So then we get to Bertram's Guide to the Age of Mortals, which is just one of those tie-in kind of things, kind of an encyclopedic thing that they like to write over at Wizards of the Coast or TSR or whatever it was at the time. It says Wizards of the Coast on the edge. Then we get to the Raistlin and Caramon series, the first one anyway, that happened after the original Dragonlance series. This is Time of the Twins, and then War of the Twins, and Test of the Twins. I've read the original Dragonlance series, and I have a annotated hardback copy of it somewhere that I'll probably show one of these days in another video where I go over all my hardbacks. Here is the Soul Forge. That's Raistlin right there on the front. And then Brothers in Arms. I think that's the last of the books I have that star these two. Could be wrong, but then here's Heroes Volume 1, The Legend of Huma. Lost Legends Volume 1, Venus Solamnus, which is, I think, about the Knights of Solamnia. If you've read the Dragonlance Chronicles, the first series, you know who Sturm Brightblade is. He was one of the Knights of Solamnia, so that's about them. And then here's one about a mage from way back in the day that was always talked about in the Dragonlance series, and this is Fistandantilus Reborn. And then we have a second Dragonlance series here called The War of Souls. This is Volume 1, Dragons of the Fallen Sun. And Dragons of the Lost Star, Volume 2. And finally, Dragons of the Vanished Moon. These I have not read. So that's that for the front of that shelf. So the back side of that next shelf starts off with a bunch of Ravenloft books. I think these are in maybe chronological order. I don't think they're in publication order though. Probably chronological order. I'm not sure though. Here is Vampire of the Mist. It's by Christy Golden. Night of the Black Rose by James Lauder. Dance of the Dead, another Christy Golden production. And a guy I never heard of before, J. Robert King with Heart of Midnight. Here is Elaine Bergstrom, Tapestry of Dark Souls. If you were saying that like a Swede, you'd say Bergström. And then another J. Robert King, Carnival of Fear. And then I Straw by P. and Elrod. I actually had this one in hardback a long time ago, and I read it. Thought it was a little slow, but you know, a lot of times vampire books are kind of slow if they're told from the vampire's viewpoint. At least the few I've read anyway. Another Christy Golden, The Enemy Within. Chet Williamson with Mordenheim. And here is, I guess it's an anthology, Tales of Ravenloft. And Tower of Doom by Mark Anthony, who went on to write a lot of Dungeons and Dragons stuff. Another Elaine Bergstrom or Bergstrom. This one's Baroness of Blood, right there. And Death of a Dark Lord by Laurel K. Hamilton. famous for the Anita Blake Vampire Hunter series. And then Tanya Huff, another fairly well-known fantasy author, Scholar of Decay. Jean DeWeese, never heard of, but here's King of the Dead. Pretty cool cover on that one. Andrea Cardarell with To Sleep with Evil. And another Jean DeWeese, Lord of the Necropolis. There. Shadowborn, William Connors and Carrie Bebris. Never heard of either one of them. And then the last Ravenloft I have is another P.N. Elrod. It's I Strahd, The War Against Azalin. Right there. And believe it or not, I got all 19 of these books for about $1 when they were on sale. It was like a fill a bag with books and pay $1 kind of a situation. So that's what I did. And they all happened to be sitting on the shelf. So I was really happy to see that. Now we go to some Greyhawk stuff. And this is an old Gary Gygax novel, The Saga of Old City. Some of you may have read this years and years and years ago. It's about Gord the Rogue. So the next set of series of Greyhawk novels I have pretty much kind of novelizes a bunch of the old second edition adventure modules that they had. This one is Against the Giants right here. Then White Plume Mountain. If you ever played Dungeons and Dragons in the 80s, you may have seen a lot of these in the stores. If you played D&D recently, maybe you've seen some of these things. Here's Descent into the Depths of the Earth, The Temple of Elemental Evil. There was a video game for this one a while, years ago. I remember it being a big deal because when they initially sent it out, the CD that was in the box crashed people's computers and messed up their hard drives. But they fixed it pretty quick. Here's Queen of the Demon Web Pits, probably my favorite module because of all the drow in it, or drow, depending on how you say it. And here is the Keep on the Borderlands. These are probably out of order because I think I probably should have started with this one. Last, probably the most famous module in the history of Dungeons and Dragons, the Tomb of Horrors. Now, the only Planescape book that I know of or have, obviously, is Planescape Torment. I think this is a novelization of the video game plot. Not 100% sure on that. And the next 10 books are some short novels that were released to help promote I think it was D&D version 3 or version 3.5. I don't remember 100% for sure, but this one is called The Savage Caves by T.H. Lane. If you ever bought any of those D&D books, you may remember flipping through them that there was a lot of focus on the different character illustrations. There wasn't so many pictures of battle scenes and all that kind of stuff. It was really character focused, and a lot of these covers are like that. There's The Living Dead. That's the second book, and that's the last part of the back of that shelf. And now starting on the front part of that shelf, continuing with those kind of tie-in promotional novels. Here is Oath of Nerul, City of Fire, The Bloody Eye, Treachery's Wake, Plague of Ice, which I think is a pretty cool cover. I like the blue on it. The Sundered Arms, Return of the Damned, and finally, The Death Ray. That's it for those tie-in books. The next setting that gets some time on the shelves is the Dark Sun setting. And this is the Tribe of One series, which I only have books 2 and 3. This is the Seeker and the Nomad. Then we get to the Prism Pentad. This is book 1, The Verdant Passage. The Crimson Legion. The Amber Enchantress, right there. So they're all pretty cool Brahm covers, if you know who Brahm is. The Obsidian Oracle. And that was the last of the Prism Pentad. Then we get to the Chronicles of Athos. And I think there's 5 books in this, but I only have, oh no, I have 5 books. I think I'm missing the 5th book of the Prison Pentad. I have all 5 books of the Chronicles of Athos. This is The Brazen Gambit by Lynn Abbey, who did a lot of Thieves World stuff. The Darkness Before the Dawn. The Broken Blade. Another Lynn Abbey, Cinnabar Shadows. And then the 5th book in that, The Rise and Fall of a Dragon King. Right there. I don't know how well you can see that because it's kind of dark. Then we jump to my favorite setting, the Forgotten Realms, and we get The Nobles, Book 3, Escape from Undermountain, right there. And Baldur's Gate. I think this is a novelization of the video game, which was a really great game. Baldur's Gate 2, Shadows of Amn. Then we get to the Year of Rogue Dragons series by Richard Lee Byers. Just book 1, The Rage. Book 2, The Right. And book 3, The Ruin. I really like Richard Lee Byers' short stuff, but I haven't managed to read any of these yet. One of these days. And then some Drow stuff by Elaine Cunningham, who is a really good writer. I've read a few of her books. This is Daughter of the Drow. Tangled Webs. Then I think the last in that series is, the series is Starlight and Shadows, Volume 3. This one's called Windwalkers. Some more Elaine Cunningham. This is the Counselors and Kings series. The Mage Hound, Book 1. Cover by John Foster. It's pretty good. And then The Floodgate. And finally, Book 3, The Wizard War. So that's it for the front of that shelf. And on the next shelf, we're continuing with Elaine Cunningham and the Dream Spheres. And then Evermeet, Isle of Elves. Then we get into some Troy Denning, Beyond the High Road. And then we get to what I think is called the Cormyr Saga. This is The City of Splendors, Ed Greenwood and Elaine Cunningham. And then just Cormyr, Ed Greenwood and Jeff Grubb. Death of the Dragon, Ed Greenwood and Troy Denning. And then possibly the most famous mage in all of the Forgotten Realms, Elminster, The Making of a Mage. Elminster and Myth Draenor. The Temptation of Elminster. Elminster in Hell. And Elminster and his apparently really mad daughter, because if that's her jumping at him, she's really not happy. Elminster's Daughter is the name of that book, by the way. Not Elminster and his really mad daughter. And then Elminster Must Die. And that's all the Elminsters I've got. But I got one more Ed Greenwood here. This is Silverfall, Stories of the Seven Sisters. Then we get to the Finder Stone trilogy, I guess. And this is Azure Bonds. You may remember an old D&D Gold Box video game called Curse of the Azure Bonds. I think this book is, they're related. Book 2, The Wyvern's Spur. And Song of the Sorials. And I've got one book from the Lost Gods series, I guess. This is Tamora's Luck. And then we get to a series about a group called the Harpers, which was basically a band of adventurers, I think bards and rogues and stuff like that, that went around the Forgotten Realms trying to influence things so that people didn't get hurt too bad and things turned out the way they wanted. This is book 1 by Troy Denning, The Parched Sea. There's 16 books in this group. They're all by different authors, though, with some repeat authors. Here's Elf Shadow by Elaine Cunningham. This one's pretty good. And then Red Magic by Jean Rabe. The Night Parade by Scott Siensen. The Ring of Winter by James Lauder. Crypt of the Shadow King by Mark Anthony. Soldiers of Ice by David Cook. So that's it for the backside of that shelf. Continuing with the Harpers, Book 9, Elaine Cunningham again, Elf Song. Starting the backside of that fourth shelf there. Then Ed Greenwood with Crown of Fire. That's book 9 of the Harpers, but then I kind of interrupt the flow a little bit because I think these 3 books, the Chandril Saga trilogy, kind of goes along with book 9 there. This is Spellfire, and then the Crown of Fire, and book 3, Hand of Fire, right there for Chandril Saga. Then we get back to the numbered Harpers. This is number 10, Masquerades. Curse of the Shadow Mage. You can see by Mark Anthony again. Similar guy from that other Crypt of the Shadow King cover. Then The Veiled Dragon by Troy Denning. Silver Shadows, Elaine Cunningham. Stormlight. And the penultimate book, number 15, Finder's Bane. And finally for the Harpers, the last one in the series, Thornhold by Elaine Cunningham. Now, the next series is the Symbia series. I used to have all 7 of them, but I read the first 4 and then I think I got rid of them at a yard sale or something. But here's one called Lord of Stormweather and Sands of the Soul there. And finally, Heirs of Prophecy. And one of my favorite characters in that series was a guy named Aravis Kale, and he was kind of the main, kind of like Alfred to Batman for the family that was the main characters in that Symbia series. And this is book 1 of the Aravis Kale trilogy, Twilight Falling. And this is a really good series. Dawn of Night. And then book 3, Midnight's Mask. And then there was a second trilogy featuring Aravis Kale, but this is called the Twilight War series. And this is book 1, Shadowbreed. There's book 2, Shadowstorm. There. And book 3, Shadow Realm. And we get to the Lost Empires series. There's 4 books that I have here. I don't know if there were more. This is book 1, The Nether Scroll by Lan Abbey. There was a really annoying goblin in that one, or orc or something. Really didn't like it that much. The Lost Library of Cormanthier by Mel Odom. Faces of Deception. Troy Denning again. Writes a lot of tie-in stuff. Clayton Emery, Star of Kursra. So looking kind of like an Egyptian motif there. And then we have a bunch of Realms of the anthologies. I've got Realms of the Arcane right here. And Realms of the Deep. And the Realms anthologies will continue on the front part of that shelf in a minute. I meant back part of the next shelf. So continuing, Realms of the Dragons, Realms of Infamy, Realms of Mystery, and Realms of Shadow. And 2 more, Realms of the Underdark, Realms of Valor. I also have Realms of Magic over there on one of these shelves, but I'm reading it, so I'm not including it in this. Oh, one last, Realms of War, right there. Then we get to one of my favorite authors, R.A. Salvatore. You know what's coming probably. Drizzt Do'Urden. I've read everything up to this book. This one is the Transitions trilogy, so I'm like way behind on these, but this is book 1, the Orc King, the Pirate King, right there, the Ghost King, Gauntlgrim, part of the Neverwinter quadrology. I only have the first 2 in this in paper copy. I have the rest in e-copy. Book 2, Neverwinter. I've got Charon's Claw and the one that comes after that as ebooks. And then the Collected Stories of Drizzt. The Legend of Drizzt Anthology, actually is what it says under his name, but it's the Collected Stories with him. Then the very first gold box game, I think, was called Pool of Radiance. Here's a novelization, I think based on the plot of the game. And now we finally switch settings once again, and we get into Eberron, and this is the Dreaming Dark series, book 1, City of Towers. These have nice matte covers on them, so they don't shine so much in the light, which is good. Book 2, The Shattered Land. And book 3, The Gates of Night. The Gates of Night, book 3. Some more Eberron. This is the Lost Mark series. This is Marked for Death. The Road to Death. You're going to see a theme here. The Queen of Death. So there's that trilogy. The last Eberron I have is a quadrology, which is called The War Torn. Here's book 1, The Crimson Talisman. The Orb of Zoriat. In the Claws of the Tiger. Right there. Blood and Honor, the last book of that series. And then the final book on the back side of that shelf, I'm not sure what setting this one is set in, but this is The Seal of Karga Gul. The Seal of Karga Kull. So there's that. That's it for the back side of that 4th shelf. And next, what sits on the front of that 4th shelf is a bunch of copies of the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction from the 80s and early 2000s. I bought the ones from the 80s at a charity auction that they had at my old job a long time ago. I probably could have read 5 pages a day and finished all of these by now, but I keep them around. If you're interested in finding them or reading any of them, you can probably go onto the Internet Archive and find them. I was able to find a lot of them as PDFs out there, so take a look there. This is the July 1980 issue, so there's that. Here's the August 1980 issue. This is September 1980, October 1980. There's November 1980 with the Harlan Ellison image on the front there. One of my favorite short story writers, Harlan Ellison. He's kind of an acquired taste, though. Some people don't like him. Here's December 1980. Here's February 81. Not sure what happened to January. May have already read it, I don't know. March 1981. Right there. April 81. May 81. June 81. February 82. You can see that one's a little beat up right there. Here's April 82. Not sure what happened to March. Here's May 82. June 82. July 82. I've always thought this was a cool cover. August 82. September 82. October 82. November 82. January 83. That's a pretty cool cover too. March 83. April 83. May 83, June of 83. I got a bunch of these, so still a few more to go. July 83, August 83, September 83, October 83, November 83, December 83, January 84. And the last few from the 80s, this is February 84, March 84. I always like that cover too. April 84. Last of the 80s, this is May 1984. Then we jump to, I'll go backwards on these few because of the way they sit on the shelf. This is March 2006, February 2005. I only bought these sporadically when I happened to see them at Barnes & Noble. January 2005, March 2004, October, November 2004. I bought this one because of the Richard Schwedick story in it with these dinosaur guys right here. So, and then October, November 2003. And then last of the Fantasy and Science Fiction magazine, this was the 50th anniversary issue, and it is October, November of 1999. So, there's that. That's what the colorful spines sitting on the front of that fourth shelf are. Now for the back side of that bottom one, if you've watched my Books Worth Keeping video or my Books Worth Keeping the sequel video, then you've already seen a lot of these. So I'll try to go through them pretty quick. Damnation Game by Clive Barker. Books of Blood Volume 1. Books of Blood Volume 2. I read all these in the 80s when Clive Barker was huge. Books of Blood Volume 3. Early 90s too. 80s and early 90s. In the Flesh. The Inhuman Condition. Cabal. And The Great and Secret Show, which is probably my favorite book by him. I had a good copy of Weave World that had a pretty cool image inside the front, and I have no idea what happened to it. I really wish I still had it because I really liked that copy. Maybe I'll find it one of these days in some place I wasn't expecting it. Now we jump to one of the few Star Trek tie-ins I have. The main reason I like these is, you know, Khan is pretty cool. Not in a good way, but, you know, an interesting character. This is The Eugenics War, Volume 1. Eugenics Wars, Volume 1 by Greg Cox. Rise and Fall of Khan Union Singh. What I really like about these books is that he managed to work in some real world events that happened during the times that Khan was actually kind of contemporary with us in the 70s and 80s. And this is The Eugenics War, Volume 2. So the main character in this is Gary Seven. He's basically gone back to try to figure out why Khan's doing what he's doing and maybe try to stop him, that kind of thing. It's a very entertaining couple of books. There's a third book in the series called Terrain in Hell, which I have, but I haven't read it yet. Then my favorite author here, Tim Powers, Declare. That's one of several copies of that I have. Dinner at Deviant's Palace. The Drawing of the Dark. And Last Call, which is the beginning of the Fault Lines trilogy, which continues with Expiration Date and Earthquake Weather. On Stranger Tides, one of the Pirates of the Caribbean scripts is based off of this. It's even in the title of the movie itself. And then The Stress of Her Regard, right there. This is probably one of my favorite books by Tim Powers. That and Declare. And then 3 Days to Never. A couple books by Mickey Zucker Reichert that I've mentioned here and there. I use this one as an example of a book with a really good ending. The Legend of Nightfall. And then The Return of Nightfall, which is the sequel, but you can read either one. It doesn't really matter if you've read the first one, if you want to read the second one. The Chosen and the Changeling, which is a duology by it says J. Gregory Keys, but it's same as Greg Keys. So this one is The Waterborn, and then The Black God. And then the last book on the back part of that shelf is the first book in his Age of Unreason 4-book series. This one's called Newton's Canon. So that's that for the back of that shelf. So moving on, we've got A Calculus of Angels, book 2 in the Age of Unreason. And then Empire of Unreason, book 3. And The Shadows of God, which is book 4. And that's it for the Age of Unreason. Then we've got a series that was written by, I think, 4 or 5 different authors, but it was curated by Philip Jose Farmer. It's all one big story. This is called The Dungeon. It's volume 1 right there. Volume 2. This one is called The Dark Abyss. Volume 3, The Valley of Thunder. Volume 4 is The Lake of Fire. Volume 5 is The Hidden City, right there. And then Volume 6 is The Final Battle. So that's it for that 6-book series. I read it in the 80s, really liked it. I don't know if it holds up or not, but it's pretty interesting. Last but not least, the rest of that shelf is all related to Thieves World. And I recently read the original 12-book series. I've done videos rating all of those books. So if you want to check those out, they're on my channel somewhere. But here's book 1, Thieves World. Book 2, Tales from the Vulgar Unicorn. Book 3, Shadows of Sanctuary. Storm Season. The Face of Chaos. Wings of Omen. The Dead of Winter. Soul of the City. Blood Ties. Aftermath. And the last 2 books, Uneasy Alliances. This one's probably my favorite cover of the whole bunch. And then Stealers of Sky. So that's the original 12-book series. And then I've got the Sanctuary novel that Lynn Abbey wrote and published in 2002. And then a couple other anthologies that were in 2002 and 2004, Turning Points and Enemies of Fortune. I haven't read these yet. And then there were a bunch of tie-in novels written in the 80s when the original series was going on too. These first 3 are by Janet Morris. This is Beyond Sanctuary. And these 3 focus on a character named Tempest and a bunch of soldiers that are called the Stepsons, and a guy named Nico, and a witch named Roxanne. And they're all fighting a war against each other or with each other, I'm not sure. This one's book 2, Beyond the Veil. And Beyond Wizard Wall, book 3. So that's those 3. And then the last 2 that sit on that shelf are by Andrew Offutt, and they feature probably my second favorite character in all of Sanctuary, and that is Shadow Spawn, right there. And then The Shadow of Sorcery. Also, I think Shadow Spawn's the main character in this one as well. So that's pretty much it. So there you have it. If you've had the patience to watch all the videos where I've gone over these bookshelves and talked about the 1,100 plus books I've got, then thanks for sticking with it. One of these days, I've read some of these, but most of them I haven't. I've always waited till a series was finished before I started reading the series itself. Sometimes that's bitten me in the ass because I didn't like what I was reading in the first book, and I just didn't even want to bother, even though I'd already wasted the money on some of them. But, you know, I'm hoping all these books behind me are worth the effort and the money that I've had to spend on them. You know, the effort from dragging them around as I moved around from place to place and that kind of thing. So anyway, so that's all my books. Leave comments below if you got anything to say, or if you've read any of these and you want to tell me how good they are or what your thoughts on any of them were. Other than that, I'll say bye for now.